Hey friends. Well, I had an amazing session this morning with a client and dear friend. And and as usually happens on a really powerful session, a little nugget of something just comes through. It's this interesting feeling sometimes of like being in a conversation and somehow it's like that radio gets tuned to the frequency just right and information just starts coming in. It's sometimes, and it's a lot of times it's an outgrowth of the conversation we're having, but something somehow separate, or it's like a view of what we're talking about spontaneously pops into my awareness from a slightly higher altitude. And today that was the experience I had that felt palpable and then turned into a kind of insight. Was there's a when we are communicating, or when we are simply thinking, or simply being conscious, being aware, there's such a thing as altitude, the altitude of our awareness. And what I mean by that is, I've talked about this over the last several weeks for sure, and probably longer than that, in the sense that our consciousness, I've talked a little bit about moving from reading Sadhguru's books to reading the book that I read by Ibram Kendi, and then more recently this book about how humans make meaning through narrative. Having the experience of going from this kind of cosmic perspective of Sadhguru into a perspective that's more intellectual, academic, not any less interesting by any means. I mean, these are riveting books that I have read, and I'm still in the middle of the second one. But their conversation is at a different altitude. It's just they're looking at a specific area of human life, and it's being explored in great detail and with incredible elegance and intelligence, but it's not the same level of awareness that's being explored. Sadhguru is really talking about consciousness and awareness and karma and spiritual existence in a way that almost transcends Earth. I would imagine that what somebody like that has tapped into really extends to the nature of consciousness anywhere. Now, obviously, that's hard to experimentally verify, but I just when I resonate with those with the frequency and with the perspective that he is able to transmit through his words, it's like he's talking about features of the universe. He's talking about the nature of consciousness anywhere in the universe. Whereas the books I've been reading more recently they're not talking about the nature of the universe. They're talking about the nature of human beings. They're talking about, in some cases, very specific kind of intellectual, mental, cultural features of what it is like to be human on Earth, and sometimes even what it is like to be a human on Earth in America. So the domain becomes more contained. It becomes more becomes a smaller area of focus. And what stood out to me, and I'm trying to sort of piece together how this came through in my conversation this morning, because this is not at all what we talked about. It's just that it showed up at some point. But there was this wonderful way in which I started to be able to observe, oh, yeah, the different altitudes that we speak from create spheres of it's like they create they create they create the territory. They create an image of reality on that level. And I promise I'm going somewhere with this. I really am. What showed up as what I'm calling my insight is that the higher the altitude of the conversation, the more inclusive it is, in the sense that in any kind of subdomain of human pursuit, right? If we're talking about academia, if we're talking about philosophy or politics or sociology or government, anywhere that we would have that we're having a conversation about a certain kind of domain of human exploration, we're talking about cyclicality, right? All thought is cyclical. We've learned this from Sadhguru and other people who've come to the world with that kind of perspective. All action is cyclical for the same reason, because it exists. All of existence is cyclical. So when we're probing into a given domain of life, that cyclicality is not necessarily a problem. That doesn't mean that it's inherently malfunctioning in some way. It just means that there's no ultimate liberty to be found there. Ultimately, we're talking about refining and clarifying a specific area of life to hopefully place it in a healthy relationship with the rest of life. And that's a vitally important task. It's as important as doing deep inner work. Certainly there can be times where it's as or more important to handle that, to kind of get the building blocks of our society into good order, so that we live in a healthy world, so that there's not, and it's almost like saying, is it more important to exercise the whole body or to take care of a liver problem? Well, if you have a liver problem, that's pretty important to take care of. All of a sudden, going for a run because it's healthy for your body might not be the most important thing. You might want to spend some isolated, focused time on the issue, which is how I see, people who are doing incredible work of diving into one or the other kind of areas of human life and saying, hey, look at what we're doing here. Maybe we should do this differently. Let's talk about that. Let's get really clear on how this works. But one of the byproducts of that kind of specificity is that it also creates a greater and greater potential. The lower the altitude of the exploration, the greater the potential for disagreement and for non-inclusion. That's just the nature. The smaller scale you go, the less it includes. And so what was coming to me through this conversation, and again, right now I can't for the life of me remember why this particular insight showed up in the middle of this particular conversation. Ever happened to you? But the insight that showed up was, the higher the altitude, the greater the reach. which is why, when you look at the great orators and the great sort of unifying leaders and magnetic people, they're very frequently speaking from a very high altitude, because I think either instinctively or consciously and deliberately, they know that the higher we go, the greater the reach of our perspective, the more other people and the more of life they're actually speaking to. And that's significant if we want to frame messages and create, if we want our contribution to be a unifying one, to unite the world, to be a force for cohesiveness and bringing people together. That altitude that we're speaking from really kind of matters, because that is the power to influence and to create to kind of plant the seeds of connection, and then potentially talk about the work we have to do, talk about the changes we got to make. But something just about where we are in our consciousness and what impact that has on both on the content of what we're saying and communicating, but also on the reach of it. Who and what and how much of the world is included and how much of the world it pertains to is significant. It's something that really that actually, because then we can choose what altitude we're going to come from, assuming that we're aware of what that means, and that we can access those various altitudes. I mean, again, this is Ken Wilber 101. His whole thing is about a spectrum of consciousness, and ultimately becoming aware of the fact that everywhere on the spectrum is part of an inclusive hierarchy and a interdependent, completely inextricably interdependent whole that can either be healthy or unhealthy depending on our approach to the various levels, and how much of whether we've taken levels and repressed them or banished them. How much of life can we let in? And so I think maybe this morning what was happening was just that was kind of showing up for me in a way that is, potentially relevant to me, or somehow trying to tell me something about how I communicate and what it really is, and I'm both what my intention is and how I might consider my own strategy for saying what I think, for contributing something to the world that the world can actually use. So that's what showed up, folks. Thanks for watching. Thanks for sticking with me. It's a lot coming through sometimes, and I'm trying to throw a net around it. I appreciate you. Have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow.